everyone, and welcome to Story Stalking, episode 3 of season 1. And we've been reading to you each week from this anthology that you see before you, In the Key of 13, which was written by the Mesdames of Mayhem and brought to you by Carrick Publishing in 2019. And it's just got a great lineup of authors in it. Our first 2 episodes were terrific and were really well received. And our third story from this anthology is going to be A Contrapuntal Duet by Blair Keetch. Blair is a fairly new thriller writer on the scene, so I hope that you're really going to enjoy him. He's got a novel coming out soon, which I believe is called Flight Risk. I hope I got that right. And now, without any further preamble, I'll bring you A Contrapuntal Duet by Blair Keetch from In the Key of 13. Even as the music fades, I look back through the years, and I wonder if the chime of the triangle had, in fact, been a warning bell. It was early March when I first met Jeannie, on a day when the beauty of winter had long passed. Snowbanks were high, and most city sidewalks were impassable. I'd been wandering the basement corridors of Corner Hall, looking for a former teacher who generously offered me a spare ticket to a concert that evening. I walked past rehearsal rooms and studios, some large enough to hold small orchestras. In the hallway, exuberant students chatted. Coats were piled outside open classroom doors, and larger musical cases like those for cellos performed sentry duty. The teeming space belonged to Enid Fletcher, and a big oak desk dominating the far end of the room indicated her prestige and her influence. However, I never saw her sitting behind it. Rather, she'd be perched on the edge of it, or, typically, roaming the rehearsal room, weaving between chairs and deftly sidestepping instruments. Along one wall ran a low row of bleachers that served as both a cheering stand and an informal gathering place for gossip and flirting. This was the maelstrom into which I stepped, a cacophony of flutes and oboes, shouted taunts and jeers, dueling French horns, someone performing scales on an off-key xylophone, and a girl with striking looks and green hair, leading an impromptu chant of Queen's "We Will Rock You." I searched in vain for Enid. Nervously, I cleared my throat. "Excuse me." Everyone was oblivious to my presence. I was about to shout louder in an effort to get through when something strange, almost magical, occurred. The wild-haired girl stopped mid-chant and held her triangle aloft before giving it a short tap. I couldn't hear it above the din, but it was like a silent dog whistle, audible only to her fellow students. The racket stopped abruptly. The girl struck the triangle again, and a clear, delicate note reverberated through the classroom. After a few seconds, I met her expectant gaze. "The rest is silence," I said. She rolled her eyes. "Oh, please, not Shakespeare." It was my first glimpse of her intelligence and petulance. "And you are?" "Charles Solikov." It was Enid Fletcher returning to her class with a vanilla latte from Starbucks. "Charles is a music critic with quite an esteemed reputation," Enid said. That was gracious, to say the least, especially since most of my early reviews had been published in community newspapers. "A music critic?" The girl tossed her green hair back in exasperation. "Isn't that like a level below high school teacher? I mean, like those who don't succeed teach, and those who can't teach criticize." If that was a veiled insult at Enid, she ignored it. "In fact, Jeannie, Charles is a very accomplished bassoonist." That, of course, has the same career value as a very accomplished 8-track repairman, but for a second it seemed to impress Jeannie. Oh, like Bolero, she said breathlessly. Then, her voice dripping with disdain, she added, am I supposed to be impressed by a faggot player? Behind me in the bleachers, someone gasped at the political incorrectness of the word faggot, unaware that it was the medieval name for the bassoon. Actually, I'm impressed by your grasp of the idiophone, I replied. Jeannie waited for a sarcastic comment. Like the bassoon, the triangle is underappreciated and not often given its proper due. Liszt's Piano Concerto No. 1 is a prime example. I paused, afraid of sounding any more pretentious. To my surprise, Jeannie was always full of surprises. She looked at Enid. Any chance you have another spare ticket for tonight's concert? The concert turned out to be a hackneyed version of the Mikado that would have had Gilbert and Sullivan leaping to their deaths from the Gardiner Expressway had they been alive and visiting Toronto. Yet, to my amazement, Jeannie was surprisingly kind in her comments. This is the type of music that brings laughter to so many, no matter what the quality, she said during intermission, while sipping third-rate wine in a plastic cup, while I nursed a craft beer that I had dismissively called IPA, Idiot Piss Ale. We must have made a curious sight, an obvious free spirit in intense conversation with a buttoned-down introvert. It was the beginning of what Jeannie referred to as our contrapuntal romance, two separate tunes being sung at the same time, but making beautiful music nonetheless. But that first night, I caught a glimpse of her mercurial personality. When our conversation inevitably turned to classical music, her opinions were strong. Mozart, overrated. Bach, truly a superstar. I love Johann. Don't you? Her eyes dared me to disagree. Even though it was a wintry night, we took the long route to her apartment, talking about a wide range of subjects, alternative to Tim Hortons coffee, her parents' indifference to her love of music, her versatility in all things keyboard, from organ to harpsichord, and even her dabbling in, yes, the triangle. I'd chalked this up to an interesting one-off experience, but when we reached her apartment lobby, she suddenly grabbed me by the elbows and looked up at me with her blue eyes. I think you should come upstairs and do bad things to me. And so it began. How do you measure the passage of years? By concert ticket stubs? By arguments won and lost? By career advancements? 8 years later, Jeannie was still known by her trademark wild-colored hair, but now it was cut by a fancy stylist in Yorkville. She still gave it her well-known toss whenever she sat down for an organ recital or to play the harp, her bright red blouse showing off her impressive figure. As for me, I became a superstar bassoonist, constantly touring the world. Well, not really. Unless you counted occasional recitals in the local church basement. The reality was more mundane and yet much more profitable. I created and moderated an online forum called A Sour Note, providing music students the world over with virtual tutorials and instant feedback. So, if I became a type of teacher, Jeannie never threw it in my face during one of our frequent arguments. Probably because A Sour Note brought in an unexpected amount of income and helped her achieve a certain degree of online fame, more than her concert appearances provided. The Sour Note revenue also allowed us to move from a cramped one-bedroom apartment to a house in Leslieville and to buy a small cottage near Bracebridge, and to receive tickets for more concerts than either of us cared to attend. It was our third YouTube video on contrapuntal music when we appeared together discussing, demonstrating, and performing Bach's The Well-Tempered Clavier that generated the online buzz. Jeannie had been in full flirtatious mode, wearing striking colors that accentuated her womanly attributes, though it was her toned arms that aroused me the most. The lesson had been loaded with double entendres, including more bad variations on fugue than I thought possible. But it caught the public's imagination and set our course in life. Maybe it also sealed our fate. Our arguments often dwelled on the online videos. I felt they were too commercial, too comical, and too common, while Jeannie adored the reckless nature of them. Yet it was my online persona, perhaps not far from reality, of a straight-laced sidekick that led to my first affair. I was semi-famous. Not well known in public, and never pestered for autographs at the local supermarket, but recognized in chamber music halls. Usually by earnest young women, university students who wore gray skirts and black tights and read poems by Leonard Cohen, who never would have conceived of sleeping with a married man until he gently touched them in the darkness of a rehearsal hall and whispered, "You make my blood sing." There was Frida, who always wanted the room pitch black when we made love, and Esther, who loved to talk dirty once behind closed doors. They were all fun flings, but carried a 10-month expiry date. The affairs would have gone on until Jeannie and I retired, settling in a home overlooking a golf course in Florida and attending orchestra concerts in Tampa. That is, if I hadn't met Winnie. I listened raptly as Winnie stood in front of a large screen with a projected manuscript. She had no notes and had been speaking for well over half an hour about Bach's The Well-Tempered Clavier. Despite her severe appearance, dark hair bluntly cut, primly dressed in a white blouse and windowpane suit, there was an underlying openness about her. I was in the front row, conducting an informal audit of her novice lecturing abilities. "Excuse me," interrupted a disheveled student. It was Scott, a talented violinist who was caught up in a false image of his own sexiness and who, I suspected, was slipping into the party circuit. I was watching Jeannie and Chuck on YouTube, and they both stated Bach intended a well temperament as opposed to an equal temperament. Not exactly true, but Jeannie, as usual, had overruled my opinion through the sheer force of her argument. Winnie shook her head briskly. An old debate that's now been dismissed by most worthwhile scholars. It no longer holds any credence. Scott mumbled a response, but Winnie cut him off. "Who do you trust? A buffoon bassoonist?" The class erupted in laughter. At first, I flinched, thinking she was unaware of my presence. Then her eyes momentarily flicked in my direction. I have met my equal, I thought, and vowed at that moment to woo her. My courtship carefully evolved over the next 8 months. It began with a chance encounter in rehearsal halls and striking up conversations about our mutual love of Vivaldi, Handel, and Bach. The bantering, intellectual respect, and cordiality I experienced with Winnie, but rarely with Jeannie, were addictive. Even so, I bided my time. I was on the verge of giving up when one day Winnie suggested having coffee. "Sorry, I can't," I said. "Busy this afternoon." I paused, then continued as if a thought had just occurred to me. "But hey, I'm free tomorrow night. Jeannie has a concert that I really don't want to attend. How about we have dinner? I know a cute little French cafe nearby." She hesitated, but I stared back innocently. The acknowledgement of my wife and my nonchalant attitude all worked in my favor. It became the first of many meals that slowly transitioned from casual cafe to candlelit dinners. Over time, it became clear that Winnie had feelings for me, and I confess I returned them equally, if not more strongly. Her intelligence, calmness, and stability were elements missing from my life. But there was a catch. "Rule number 1, she informed me, I don't sleep with married men." "And if I wasn't married?" My tone was playful. "Then torrid nights of passion would be yours." She gave me a soft but sad smile. "But you'll probably never know." What if I wasn't married, I thought. Not divorced, but what if my wife was no longer an issue? Divorce was not an option. I knew Jeannie would not only expect her half of our marital assets, but also demand more. She'd claim she was the one with the personality, the charisma, and the loyal fan following, known as the Sourettes. What Jeannie didn't know was that the BBC was considering a more serious version of a sour note. Why shouldn't I provide them with a more dignified forum and increase my status as a music expert? Yet I never considered any other options until Garth came on the scene. The unruly and disheveled composer had a bad boy reputation, even though he was easily in his 50s. He appeared rumpled, with untamed hair and nicotine-stained fingers that stood out in contrast to the white of his conductor's baton. He had a self-inflated ego and scorn for most people, including his long-suffering wife, Martha, a minor but respected opera singer. His comments on her weight and her failure to reach greater heights were well documented. I thought all of this would have repelled Jeannie, but, on the contrary, they decided to collaborate on a quartet composition. Many nights she'd come home smelling of secondhand smoke and detail Garth's sarcastic comments toward his spouse. Then why work with him? I asked. Because, for all of his faults, he is actually a genius, Jeannie admitted, and he wants to showcase my talents. It might have gone on like this for another few months, perhaps even years, had I not found out about their affair. I usually respected Jeannie's scattered files and never gave them a second glance. But I was searching for one of my music essays with her scribbled notes and had to burrow through her papers. In the mess of half-finished scores, old correspondence, and unopened junk mail, I found a loyalty statement from a hotel chain with a convention location across from the concert hall. A statement detailing weekly stays, at a special day rate, no less, every Wednesday. The time of her supposed collaboration with Garth. All the more reason for me to start over and find out if Winnie would be true to her promise of nights of endless passion. Figuring out how to kill Jeannie was surprisingly simple. Poison wasn't practical. Staging an accident would involve too much scrutiny. However, a pedestrian death, an all too common occurrence in Toronto, would receive lots of media coverage and maybe even mean double the insurance payout. And it likely would keep the focus away from me. A hit and run, Jeannie struck by a car on her nightly walk home from rehearsal, would be perfect. I would arrange an ideal alibi, play the part of the grief-stricken husband, and inherit Jeannie's estate. As for the driver, who better than Scott? He had dropped out of music school and was, by all accounts, a slave to opioids and likely open to anything to maintain his habit. And if that left a loose end, it was nothing I couldn't tidy up afterward. Who would think twice about a fentanyl overdose, or even a fatal beating? A drug deal gone wrong, part and parcel of such a risky lifestyle. You want something to happen to Jeannie? Scott greedily accepted my offer, even before I had finished outlining my proposal. Everything was set for the following Tuesday. Remember Prelude and Fugue in B minor? Jeannie asked over breakfast. I smiled. How could I forget? It was our first real concert together, after the Mikado, of course. I even get a little turned on hearing it now, Jeannie said. We still make great music together. She kissed me passionately on the lips, and for a moment I felt that old familiar thrill. See you tonight, Jeannie said, and I expect you to be awake. Practice, practice, practice. I nodded dutifully. Another church recital was on the horizon, and I'd been neglecting my bassoon. Promise, I called as she went out the door. The day ticked by ever so slowly. My internet tutorials dragged on, an endless shuffle of painful auditions with students blind to their lack of talent. Over lunch, Winnie was preoccupied. I gently prodded her until she burst out, "Maybe I should date again. Go online. Sign up for Prelude, that dating website for musicians." "Whoa, whoa," I said. "What brings this on?" "You, us," she lamented. "Where are we going? What am I doing with my life?" We'd had this conversation before, but today she seemed even more intense. "Just give me more time," I said. "More time for what? I know you're never going to divorce your wife." "No, but I've made arrangements to kill her," I thought. Instead, I said, "Give me another month, 2 at most. I promise things will be different shortly." In fact, I had no idea how Winnie would react to my plans, so I lied. "We had a candid talk this morning, and I think Jeannie's coming to certain realizations." Winnie looked slightly mollified. "Okay, 2 more months, but absolutely no more. You know, once I make up my mind, there's no going back." I only nodded. Winnie was just as iron-willed as Jeannie, but in a more agreeable way. Half an hour remained before Jeannie usually arrived home. I was waiting expectantly for the sound of sirens, or maybe even a police car with 2 somber officers clambering out to break the devastating news. Yet the only sound was the distant ticking of a metronome on top of the piano in another room. I thought longingly of a bottle of scotch in the den, but didn't want to be anything but completely sober when I heard the tragic news. I was pacing back and forth when I noticed my double reed soaking in a glass of water where Jeannie had left it on the dining room table. I was totally out of practice, so perhaps this was a way to soothe my nerves. I reassembled my bassoon and fixed the reed to the bocal when I heard a disturbance outside. Opening the door, I found Garth underneath his usual plume of smoke, furiously stuffing sheets of music into our mailbox. "Garth, to what do I owe this pleasure?" He stared up at me. "You can give that unfaithful slut of a wife this mess of a music score. This is derivative and badly cribbed crap. I refuse to continue this charade any further." "After all this work, all those evenings spent together, you're giving up?" "What work? She comes over 2 nights a week, spends 15 minutes with me, then heads out the door with Martha. I warned her before. I can't collaborate via email." I thought I heard a vague chime of a triangle, but I continued on. "I thought Wednesdays were devoted to working on the chamber piece." "Wednesdays?" Garth looked perplexed. "No. Wednesday is my day to go to Stratford to visit my mom at that retirement hellhole." "Give me that," I hissed, and grabbed the sheets from Garth's hands. "Go home and leave me alone." He stared at me, searching for the perfect retort, but gave up and stamped off into the snowy night. Back inside, I glanced at the clock. Jeannie was now more than 45 minutes late. I imagined a crowd of people huddled around her prone body, or maybe she was in some hospital corridor with a sheet draped over her face. I smoothed the crumpled music score in my hand and took a closer look. The words "bassoon intro" were scribbled on the first lines of the notes. I smiled. What better image of a dedicated husband than to be playing his wife's composition when notified of her death? I picked up the bassoon and started to play. I paused briefly. I was so out of practice, even the reed tasted strange. I wet my lips, made a minor adjustment to the strap, and resumed playing. After 4 minutes, I stopped. Garth was right. It was an uneasy mashup of styles. Overall, a melodic mess. I tried again in case my first impression was overly harsh, but if anything, it was worse the second time I played it. Plus, I kept slipping off the handrest. My phone buzzed on a nearby music stand announcing the arrival of a text. A message from Scott's burner phone. Sorry, missed opportunity. We'll try tomorrow. A missed opportunity, I thought, or a drug deal too good to pass up? I wondered. And if it was a missed opportunity, where was Jeannie? As if in answer to my thoughts, a floorboard creaked. Jeannie, I called. No, it's me. The fat lady sings. Martha stepped into the light, her eyes intently searching my face. Jeannie followed, right behind her. Ladies, I smiled in welcome, but my face felt lopsided. What brings you here? Charles, Jeannie said, I did mean it this morning when I said I loved you. Once. A wave of tiredness crept over me. When I tried to stand, my legs were as numb as my lips had become. Jeannie saw me look around toward my bassoon, which had slid to the ground. That's right, Charles. Your reed was poisoned. But don't worry, all traces of it will be gone by the time we dump you into the lake. Martha and Jeannie exchanged glances. What a tragedy, Martha said. A second-rate musician has too much to drink, goes for a moonlight walk at his cottage and gets disoriented. Falls through the ice, Jeannie finished. Too bad we couldn't figure out a way for Garth to join you, Martha added. But don't worry, he's our project for next session. I looked searchingly at Jeannie. What's the matter, my love? Cat got your tongue? She laughed softly. What do you want to ask me? How long Martha and I have been together? Far longer than you can imagine. You men and your egos, so wrapped up in your own little worlds and your own tawdry affairs. Yes, I know all about them, Charles. In my last moments, I realized that despite her irrational ways and our roller coaster life, I still loved her, even though she was intent on killing me. I struggled to warn her. Scott, I finally mumbled. What's that? Yes, I think we will be scot-free, she said. This has been carefully planned. I'm not as impetuous as everyone thinks I am. As the music fades, I wonder if she will be walking home tomorrow, if Scott will follow through on his pledge. I'll never know, but perhaps even in death will still be a contrapuntal duet. The end. And this has been a contrapuntal duet by Blair Keetch, an absolutely wonderful and diabolical story that was featured in the Key of 13 by the Mesdames of Mayhem, a crime anthology, which came out from Carrick Publishing in 2019. I hope you'll go and look for the book online and order it at your favorite retailer and enjoy the many great stories by many great authors that are featured in it. And that's it for today's Story Stalking reading. I hope you'll join us next week when we'll be bringing you a reading of Hit Me With Your Pet Shark by Lisa DeNicolets, a funny and really gritty and taut drama, crime drama from In the Key of 13 by the Mesdames of Mayhem. And our thanks go out to Blair Keetch for his wonderful story today. And our thanks also to Ted Carrick for our theme music, Eyes of Gold. And the biggest thanks of all to all of our listeners. Hope to see you next week.
A dusty road, a man alone. His vital signs go on hold. And I don't know what you've been told, but But the years have turned my eyes gold. And I told you what you told me, we'd never be in the same boat for free. Yet it rides